It's a row of trees that we planted many years ago, and the rest of it is a new installation of heirloom trees, and I'm going to turn it over to Amigo to talk about his project, the Felix Gillet Foundation.
Okay, thank you, Lou. I didn't realize I was going to talk about this, so I get to be innovative here. So I live in the Sierra foothills, and I think everybody else here is an immigrant. My family came here in the 1760s, but they brought plants with them, and those plants are mostly what we eat or drink. In fact, I think if I challenged somebody, they'd have a hard time mentioning something they ate that was a native crop in the last week. Very little of what we eat today is native, with a few exceptions. So the majority of what we grow and rever is things we brought here. And it came in varying waves, but the group and a bunch of the stuff came in with my family with the Spanish in the 1700s, some of which we still grow. The Mission olive is a good example that came out of the Mission, and there are others that are still in production that go back to the Mission era. And then there was a whole other wave that came in the Gold Rush era. I live in the gold country, and in Nevada County above Nevada City, California. And in September of 1970, I was out on a forested dirt road. We were out about 12 miles trying to figure out where this turned out to be an old stagecoach road, where it was going in the forest. Well, just traveling around as hippies would want to do, find out what's out there. And 12 miles down a dirt road, we came across an orchard in the middle of the forest, which at the time I had no idea of its connection to history, but I knew it was old, it was abandoned, and it had tremendous fruit in it. Apples, pears, cherries, walnut, chestnut, and without knowing it, I had stumbled onto a treasure trove of heirlooms, which at that time, 1970, I don't think heirloom was even in the lexicon of food. I certainly didn't know the term. So, we started taking care of that place, harvesting it, of course, at first, and the only thing else that was harvesting was the bears. And I didn't know it, but I couldn't see it, but right over the hill was a remnant of a hydraulic mine, which was the common form of mining there in the late 1800s. And this turned out to be a farm family that had moved there, basically to grow food for the gold miners. This particular little community had about between 500 and 1,000 people in it, and they need to feed themselves. I mean, it's many, many miles from any common food source. That said, so fast forward into the 70s, and in 1976, I started Peaceful Valley Farm Supply, and was growing a bunch of these old plants as well as new ones, and trying to get people interested in permanent culture. I think before I heard the word permaculture, but let's just not grow vegetables. Let's look at the rest of the system. And all during that 70s period until this very moment, we've been out looking for old plants that are remnants from that era. And before I knew who Felix Gillet was, I'd already been just enamored with a bunch of really cool old, both food and ornamental perennials that are survivors. That typically were planted in the 1850s to 1900, which is about when the mining era was at its peak. And people had to feed themselves, so they put vegetable gardens in, and then they eventually planted perennial crops. And people brought those from all over the planet. And it turned out this guy, Mr. Gillet, I had no idea I was following in his footsteps, but somebody walked in the nursery one day and said, there used to be a nursery here in the 1800s. I didn't, and learned fairly soon thereafter, after I found the site, that there'd been a nursery in there since the 1860s. And Felix Gillet, although he's not well known, is actually the father of most of the crops we grow in California that are in perennials. Much more impactful than the revered Mr. Burbank. And I'll just run down quickly some of the crops you and I eat that came directly out of Gillet's nursery. All of the almonds, all of the walnuts, all of the hazelnuts, virtually all of the wine grapes, all of the raisin grapes, most of the cherries, most of the pears, many of the apples, strawberries, raspberries, and I've forgotten a whole bunch, prunes, the prune
Wine
industry.
grapes.
Pardon?
Grapes.
Grapes. If it's a French varietal, it came out of Felix's nursery. So he was a nurseryman starting in opened his business in the 1860s, but he was actually starting in the 1850s. And he brought plants from all over the world, originally from his home country of France, and figured out where they would grow and then propagated them and sold them to gardeners, farmers, ranchers, homesteaders, and had a really thriving business. He ran it until 1908 when he passed away, and he shipped plants all over the world. We have receipts for shipments to Russia and Michigan and New York, as well as all over the West Coast. And he sold tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of plants. And he was a plant maniac. You guys can relate to that whole group. Just one catalog has 241 varieties of grapes in it, 18 different kinds of muscats, just to give you an idea. So this was back in the era where there was a broad diversity that we now want to mimic, varietal diversity especially. But all these common fruit and nut crops, grapes and such, all came from somewhere. Most of them came from Central Asia and Europe. And then certainly the ones that came from Asia itself. So, and he was just one of those people who was willing to try things and bring them in. So like the chestnut diversity of the West Coast, we had the world's chestnut experts out there a few years back, and they said, oh, the world's largest diversity of chestnut genes is in Nevada County, California. Who would have thunk? I had no idea, but there they are. So, the colossal chestnut is the most famous one in the chestnut industry. That's a Felix variety. You can call it colossal, if you know exactly where the mother tree is now. So at any rate, so this guy did all this stuff. I'm collecting these plants and making notes for decades. And then in 2003, I said, this is a pretty cool project that I ought to get out of it, my back of my head into the public. And so now we have, thanks good part to David, we have a nonprofit organization, Felix Gillet Institute, which is dedicated to the discovery, identification, propagation, and proliferation of these heirlooms. And so what we do is actually find the best. We now have located about 3,000 individual trees on about 700 sites. We haven't unfortunately gone through most of them, but at least we know there's a pear over here and a walnut over there and some cherries over here. And then as time allows, we go out and find these, taste test them, and evaluate them and try to identify them and see if we can tie them back to Gillet. And sometimes they do, and other times we can't figure out what they are. My wife's becoming, by default, the world expert. Hey, one of you young kids want to do something useful? Nobody knows how to identify old varieties, and I mean nobody, except in apples. Apple's the only species we really have. And grapes, I should say. Grapes also has a really good group in it. But outside of that, most species are pretty much, you have to go back and look at stuff from the 1800s to find out, if you can find out what they are. So we have a lot of varieties we found that we can't identify. We just name them after the site. But occasionally, Jennifer has gotten really good at figuring this out, and we can ID them. And then we put a name on them, we put a history lesson behind them, teach people where they came from, and then also if they're awesome, either culinary or pest resistant or disease resistant or drought resistant, which is what we've been working on for years, trying to figure out how do these things survive. Because there was obviously a lot more of them back in the day when our county had 100,000 miners, but a lot of them died. These are the ones that survived 130 years or something, and they're still going. And 99% of them don't get any human care. They were planted, taken care of when they were young, and then they went feral. So they don't get fertilized, they don't get sprayed, they don't get irrigated, they don't get pruned. Yet they still throw mega crops. And through the drought, some of them did just phenomenally. Just the opposite of what I would have expected. Now they throw big crops and lots of new growth. So what do they know that we don't? We spent a lot of money on irrigation, a lot of money on fertilization, a lot of money on pruning, and we're still, chasing this sustainability thing. So I'm enamored with these plants that taste awesome, store really good. We got a pear variety we pick in October, and it ripens at Easter or later.
Wow.
Okay, why is that? Because back in the day, you wanted stuff that could survive a long time without refrigeration. So you would have things for all these different purposes. So I had almost 60 varieties of pears. And this just goes on and on. Why do you have these things? You had a variety of cherry we haven't found yet that ripened in early April over in Vacaville area. One of these days we'll find one of those, I hope. But you find these things. I just stumbled on one this last week that's ripe, not even ripe yet. So it's way later than average. So of course you want to have things that spread out, things that aren't necessarily big culinary fruit. You can make eau de vie, or you could make wine, or you could make essences or jams. That super high bricks, super flavorful. Our favorite cherry, for example, is a tiny little cherry that has the most incredible flavor. It just, but to look at it, you wouldn't buy it. Same thing with the chestnuts. Our most favorite chestnut is the smallest of them. But people aren't going to buy those. They buy with their eyes these days. So you have to do taste tests and get people clued into these things. So at any rate, at one point we realized, especially during the drought, that some of these old trees were dying. Because they are. I mean, there's a finite life. And, you know, there are some ones, there's a revered pear tree in France that is dated to the 1600s. So they can live a long time, but generally, you know, 100 years is a pretty long life for a fruit tree, or a nut tree. So we started both the nursery project, which is now in its 8th year, growing up a diversity of these species. We're going to have a little over 100 varieties this year. And then we also started a mother orchard, botanical or biological reserve, which is originally on our property. And Lou gratefully, wonderfully said, hey, I'd like to do some of that here in a totally different climate and a totally different environment. So we have 2 or 3 of a wide variety of these species planted. Lou's been tending them in Jesus, which we both are interested in what they do here as far as productivity and hardiness and disease resistance. But also we have genetics here that we've preserved, that if we lose the mother tree or the grandmother tree in its home, which we lost 3 of them this last winter, one of them to a chainsaw, you know, this happens. Because most of these are on private property, we get permission to harvest and utilize them, but generally speaking, it varies. We had to get the city of Nevada City to pass an ordinance to require people to get a permit to cut down one of these trees, because they thought the pine trees and the cedar trees were more valuable than these old plants from their forebears. So it's a very slow process to get education going in this, but nonetheless, so we now have, if we lose one of these ones that's in our mother orchard at our site, Lou's got a backup here.